And we're live. With that clap, we're on to episode number 2. So first of all, welcome to Work Drinks, Leon and Nechama. It's lovely to have you both here. How are you? We'll start with you, Nechama. How's it going?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be here. Thanks for having me, and good to meet Leon over Skype.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're coming here from Canberra. I hear it's
Yeah,
lovely warm weather.
yeah, it is. It's very warm weather. I think we get all the extremes in Canberra, so I think we'll have a really hot summer. We obviously just had a really cold winter, so I'm newly Canberran and I'm just getting used to it, but it's really nice.
Oh, beautiful. And I see you there. The theme of this episode is all around your favorite non-alcoholic beverage. So you're drinking a tea. What you got there?
I'm drinking a lemon and ginger tea, which is my favorite tea, and all my housemates drink lemon and ginger tea, so I think we go through a big box of it probably every week.
Oh my goodness. It sounds
Nice.
like the key to that healthy roommate relationship is all around that common bond around lemon and ginger. I love it. How are you, Leon? How's it going?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm fighting fit, thank you, and thanks for having me on.
No, absolutely. It's our pleasure to have you. What's your favorite non-alcoholic beverage that you've got with you today?
Well, I'm a wild guy, mineral water. It probably reflects my wild nature.
Oh my goodness. Are you the type of guy that always goes for sparkling water when you get asked at the restaurant?
Listen, I always have, but in the old days, it gave me a decided advantage because many people have loose lips with a few drinks, and soda water in the early days was very useful.
Oh my
Wow,
goodness.
already getting some of those key insights very early on.
That's true. That's
That's a
true.
great
Even
insight.
with work drinks, you have to be careful at work drinks. If you haven't, if you've skipped lunch and you have like one glass of wine, you can be in trouble.
Exactly. Number one rule of work drinks. Well, our beverage of choice today, we were anticipating the tea theme. So we have our tea in front of us here. But given that it is our producer Sam's birthday, we thought we'd celebrate. So we've got a bit of a spiked iced tea from Brookvale Union. So that's what we've got in front of us here. Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Cheers, Leon.
Cheers.
Cheers, Nechama. And to Sam's
Cheers.
birthday, behind the technology. Happy birthday.
Happy
Happy
birthday.
birthday, Sam.
Cool. So let's get started on the real stuff. We like to begin, all of our shows by getting stuck into the formative years of our guest careers, where things really got started. And, I think for the young professional, they don't have to do too much reflection there because they've only recently got started. But for the expert professional, there's definitely a bit of thinking to do. Now, Leon, there's a lot known about you and the coveted, cases that you've been a part of. There's a lot to read about you in the media as well. But what we don't know about you is where things got started for a young Leon Zwier. Once upon a time where you're at university and you had to make that decision to start your career. I guess we'd like to get stuck into that point of your life and, where did you start your career? Was it in law? And what really motivated that decision to get started in that industry?
Well, it may come as a shock to you, but I decided I wanted to be a lawyer from the age of 5.
Wow.
I always wanted to be a lawyer. Now, I suspect that there were 2 reasons why I wanted to be a lawyer. The first was because I watched this show called Perry Mason, which is all about a lawyer that never lost a case. And I used to watch it, we all watched television together as a family in the old days. And we all watched it every Saturday night, and Perry won every single case. And I thought he was my hero. But probably the second and more serious reason for it was this. My parents, fled from Europe before the Second World War. They were very lucky and came here in 1939. My father had always dreamed of being a lawyer, and he won a scholarship that would have enabled him to study. But his family was struggling. They were poor and working in a factory, and his parents asked him not to pursue the practice of law, but to work in a factory to help put food on the table for the family. And I suppose as a very young child, when I heard that story, I think it probably motivated me from a very young age that I always wanted to be the lawyer that my father could never be.
That's amazing. I mean, Leon, you and I, in that respect, have somewhat of a shared history. I'm obviously a few or generation or so later, but my great-grandparents came to Australia after World War II as well. And I think, yeah, it's something sort of innate that if your family sort of comes from that background, you have it's just like a drive and just sort of wanting to make them proud, basically.
Yeah, well, I as a 5-year-old had a keen money sense already then, I remember fondly being on the knee of one of my grandparents' friends, and they said, "Look, when you're a lawyer, Leon, you're going to charge us." And I said, "Business is business, and pleasure is pleasure." And they thought I was likely to be successful with that view towards making money out of the law.
Wow, definitely a very sort of prudent young man at 5 years old. That's amazing, and I absolutely love those stories. Thanks for sharing, guys. For you, Nechama, obviously we know you personally, going to school together, and
Yep.
you know, doing our research beyond that sort of personal relationship. We read an article in the Sydney Morning Herald that talked about your choice following your time in school, where instead of, I guess, pursuing law, which might have been something that people would have expected for you to do, that you actually pursued a degree in fine arts. Can you walk me through, I guess, that decision as to why you wanted to start there in fine arts, and then how you actually made your way across to law?
Sure. First of all, it's very embarrassing, and it's very embarrassing that that article is out on the internet. But yeah, I guess the story is I had the marks to do law, but I wasn't really. I had some thoughts about doing it, but I didn't really feel passionately about it. I started a double degree in art theory and arts. I was majoring in English. I always loved the humanities. I thought I wanted to be a museum curator or an art critic, something like that. Yeah, as I said, unlike Leon, I didn't have a real interest or pull towards the law. And if I'm honest, it probably scared me a little bit. But I think the turning point was that in my first year studying art theory, which was an amazing degree, and I saw through to the end, I took a subject about contemporary Indigenous art in Australia, and I had an amazing professor, Tess Alice. And yeah, I sort of learnt things in that subject I hadn't learnt in my previous education, particularly about the way Indigenous people empower themselves through art politically. And it was really powerful. And I sort of began to realize that I wanted to do things in my life that were very sort of concrete and very sort of instrumental and would make a difference. And a lot of people do that in the art world, and that's what these artists were doing. But I sort of knew that I wouldn't be able to have the impact that I might want. And I just sort of realized that if you're literate in the law, it really opens up a lot of doors for you. You sort of learn to navigate this sort of complex system that can seem to exclude a lot of people. And I felt like you have a real advantage if you understand the law, basically. And so I started the next year, and I never looked back, and it was just the best decision I ever made. It's been really good.
Awesome. So I think from both of your responses, I've got a few hints here, but I'd like to know what, being someone that doesn't have so much exposure to the law industry, I'd like to know what really drives a decision to get stuck into public law or private law. So I guess, from hearing from Leon, it sounds like there's potentially more economic gain from the private side of the industry, whereas on the public side, you potentially get stuck into more social related matters.
It's interesting because I've never really, in my own mind, ever drawn that distinction between the two. I've always thought that the practice of law presents unique and bespoke opportunities to make a difference to the society in which we live. And bear in mind, my generation, unlike yours, Nechama, we were a generation of dreamers. We were the baby boomers.
Yeah.
We thought that we were all going to change the world. And it's unbelievable that you actually expressed the view that motivated you too. Because we grew up in an environment where there was world peace. As a Jew making life in Australia, having escaped, my parents having escaped the Holocaust, and my grandparents, it was a country of great opportunity, and we were all dreamers. And so I always saw going into the law as being an opportunity actually to contribute to society in a broader sense. I never viewed it any other way, and I convinced myself that everything I do is actually for the public good. And that might be what motivates me, but it's unusual. But that's my perspective. But you, Nechama, actually probably do things in the public good.
No.
Whereas I live in a dream or the future of things in the public good.
No. I think also, sorry, I probably should have qualified what I was saying before with when you're early in your career, as I am, you do have a lot of idealism, and you don't have the ability to look back at 20 or 10 years of your career and sort of reflect. So it's easy for me to sort of have that idealism and yeah, what you say, Leon, makes sense. And I also think Leon's right in saying there's not such a strict distinction actually in practice between public and private law. Like you can practice public law even if you work in sort of a commercial context. And I guess in saying that, just knowing a little bit about Leon's background, and he might want to speak to this, if you work in a commercial context, you have the ability to take on a lot of pro bono cases. And I actually used to paralegal at Leon's firm, Arnold Bloch Leibler, and yeah, they do a lot of pro bono work, and you can really sort of, yeah, you genuinely can really make a difference that way as well as in your regular work.
And I really should, it's kind of you to say it, Nechama, but I should really add to it too. I have never been motivated by the money in the law, ever. My father was very left-wing in his leanings, and he was a great influence in my life. And he always believed that if you pursue excellence in all things, money and success will follow. So I have never in my entire career been motivated by the making of money. And in fact, the glue that binds the ABL partners is not money. It's actually a commitment to the pursuit of excellence in all things. And so Nechama is right, to have taken on, British American tobacco for the McCabe family in a very famous case years ago was not about money. It was about doing what was right. Or acting for E.J. Norval, who was who was a key witness in the Rush defamation case. That was a public interest case that had nothing to do with money, but it was an important case. So Nechama is right. We have enormous breadth and scope, and we're only limited by the extent of our vision and dreaminess. And unfortunately, I think law, I don't know whether you found this, Nechama, I think that lawyers tend to be conservative in outlook. That is, the university encourages conservatism of approach. But I've always thought that it's really important to maintain a childlike view of things, not childish, a childlike view. That is, that you can actually do anything in the law. But I don't know whether it's your experience, Nechama.
I mean, it's first of all, Leon, it's just sort of nice to hear you say that, because it's nice to hear that someone who has obviously had a much longer career hasn't really had that idealism sort of eroded. And I think Leon's absolutely right in saying, because being a lawyer demands a lot of you, it's first of all a difficult degree to do, and then it can be a really demanding career. You can't really be in it for the money. Like most lawyers are in it because they find the work so challenging and so compelling. And as we've both sort of said, once you understand the law, you find yourself in all these different contexts, whether it's a sexual harassment case, a defamation case, a constitutional case. You suddenly are at the forefront of all these kind of, I guess they're social issues, and you're arguing for things that are sort of bigger than the law. So I think I'm going to remember Leon's advice to dream big, because that is really nice to hear.
I absolutely love that line. And I'd love to tie together two things that you said, Leon. I love the sort of comment around baby boomers, you were dreamers, the time of peace, were able to sort of think really big, and then also tying that to doing the right thing. I wonder, do you guys have any things that sort of ground you every day that you take with you into work that sort of allows you to always sort of stay to that true path and your purpose?
Nechama,
kick that one off and I'll respond after you. Go on.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually, that's quite a hard question. I think it's hard to answer. It's also just been a crazy year to have started in working in government. So it's grounding yourself can be sort of difficult. I think, to be honest, for me, what it would be is just, I'm just so happy living in Canberra. I moved here in January. It's such a different pace of life. I really sort of resonate with the culture of the public service. Like, I just love going into work every day. And yeah, you sort of working in government, you don't, especially in the Prime Minister's department, which is very sort of fast paced, often reactionary kind of work, you genuinely don't know what the day is going to throw at you. And I love kind of walking to work or sitting on the bus and thinking, like the thing I worked on yesterday is probably going to leave my desk today, and there's going to be a whole new thing. I have no idea what it is, and I just find that really exciting. And yeah, I love going into work.
Oh, that's so lovely to hear, Nechama. How about you, Leon?
Look, the truth is, despite the very big differences between us, I'm no different. So this is my day, okay? I work in a most incredible office in very comfortable circumstances, surrounded by brilliant young lawyers who never fail to impress me with their capability and skill, okay? Phenomenal people. I then represent some of the most sophisticated, savvy commercial clients who are on the top of their game. Then I mix with a bunch of barristers, counsel, judges who in their own way are extraordinary. And because of the nature of the work that we do, we're exposed to a whole range of people who work with, who service providers who are at the top of their game. And so you can't help but to learn every day through osmosis. I sometimes will pinch myself and say, I can't believe that we actually earn money for the kind of things that we do, because every day is fascinating. I have never once in my entire career found a day where I thought, I don't want to get out of bed and I don't want to go to work because I don't know what the day will bring. And there is always a laugh. There is always something unusual. It's very unpredictable. And so it's different. And maybe I'm a dreamer, maybe I am, but I see every case as being different, every problem as being different. And I also think, unlike a lot of my peers, there's a media aspect which I love, but the other thing too is you're dealing with human nature. And that's why I think Nechama, having a background in fine arts, literature, I think is incredibly important as a lawyer, because human nature is critical to what we do. And I often tell our litigators, when they say to me, how can I be better? I tell them, read literature, understand people, read literature.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Yeah, I think you'd be surprised. I think if you spoke to a lot of lawyers, they would have so many anecdotes of some really human experiences they've had. And those are the ones that are really sort of, really hard to forget. It is definitely a very human exercise. And just on that, I always actually felt that my art theory degree was such a nice sort of complement to the law, because it's given me this sort of broader interest, which a lot of people of our generation care about, but in issues about gender and race and things like that. That degree just gave me a really sort of strong foundation for those kind of things. And it sort of filtered into the way I studied law and the kinds of things I eventually ended up becoming interested in. But yeah, as Leon says, there are just so many different things you could be doing. I think the law sometimes has this image of being very stiff and kind of narrow and boring, but it's just not that at all. And I think, you can also tell that Leon and I are two huge law nerds. So
Jeez, I must say you've sold me on law. I think I may consider changing careers after tonight. One thing I picked up from the both of you is the importance, or I guess the significance of just human relationships in the game of law. So I'd like to dive into that. And I guess question for you, Leon, is so the Australian market's a small one and incredibly relationship driven. You've touched on it just then, but to what extent really is relationships, I guess, a part of the game and a part of excelling in the game? And what advice can you give to younger professionals in the law industry that want to start building these relationships that's going to ultimately transition into commercial outcomes when they start having to originate for the firms they work for?
Wow. I mean, Nechama, they ask very probative questions.
No, my God.
We can go on for hours about this. We can go on for a long time. I'll try and confine myself to 30 minutes.
Leon, are you charging us right now?
Yeah, thanks. So what I'd really say is that there are two axes upon which I think lawyers draw their work. The first is relationships. That is, relationships are really important at every level. And the second is expertise. You need to have expertise and you need to have relationships to really get ahead. But let me just say that, Nechama, with the kind of background you have, you also obviously are far more affable and friendly than me, but and that's important. Let me tell you, it's important. Many years ago, I think it was Nigel Boardman who was voted the world's greatest M&A lawyer globally. And he talked about he talked about being a 4A lawyer. And he said the first A to be a great lawyer is ability. It goes without saying you have to have great ability to be a success in as a lawyer, and that's so. And he then said the second is affordability. You know, if you're so expensive, as the infrastructure you carry is so massive, it doesn't matter how much you have in terms of ability, you're not affordable and you won't sustain work. He then said the third A is availability. So he said you can be the most able lawyer and the most affordable, but if you're not available, that won't translate to success. And then he got to the fourth A, and he said in the fourth A, this is more your area than mine, Nechama. He said affability. He said the fourth A is affability. You have to be affable. If you're going to be doing big work in a big team together, you have to get on with people. You have to relate to people. You have to connect to people, and they have to enjoy the experience, because otherwise you can be able, available, and affordable, but if you're not affable on a major, complicated matter, it won't work. And I suspect in your life and what you do, it's critical affability, because if you can't get on with people in the office and the people you're working with, it'd be a disaster. So affability is important in private practice too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that, Leon. I mean, I think the nature of law is that you're often working under pressure and in quite stressful circumstances. And also, law, just by its nature, is a process of argument and people putting forward different hypotheses and testing them against each other. And if you can't do that in a sort of collegiate way, you're going to have a problem. But yeah, I mean, the public service is a very small place as well. When so I work in the Prime Minister's department, which is sort of right down the hill from Parliament House, and then across the road is the Attorney General's department. And when you go for coffee downstairs, all the senior public servants know each other. They all worked together 10 years ago. Like, they all sort of shuffle around between departments. It's a very small place.
Yeah, well, I can imagine that managing the politics there would be pretty difficult. I mean, it's hard enough in a law office.
I'd love to continue on. Sorry, go on,
I'm showing my age here. I'm showing my age here, but I always think that, you know, executing one educates 1,000. But that's probably an old-fashioned view about managing in an office.
So I might not take that. No.
Absolutely love that. The 4 A's, definitely something to keep in mind. I'd love to shift, and you touched on it there, Nechama, around what it really takes to succeed in public law. During your sort of first year there, what have you picked up that you've kind of, you know, maybe written a note down or reflected on what it really takes to succeed, and some of those lessons you've got along the way?
This question I find really actually quite hard to answer. It's been, I said before, it's been a pretty crazy year. So when I joined the Prime Minister's department in January, it was going to be the year of bushfires. Like, the bushfires were still going on. It was in the department where I work, the National Bushfire Recovery Agency had been set up. That was sort of everyone's focus. And then all I sort of remember around March, early March, is people suddenly being pulled out of the department, pulled onto task forces, people just disappearing one day to the next. It was crazy. And something that happened to me was that I was redeployed along with 2,000 other graduates to Services Australia to process job seeker applications for 2 months, which I think was totally unprecedented. Has never happened before, but it just had to be done. And we did get through the backlog of job seekers, and then I got to go back to PM&C. And yeah, working in public law there, I've had some pretty amazing experiences. I was involved. Our area made a submission to the Victorian Hotel Quarantine Inquiry. You're preparing senior staff to appear before Senate estimates, things like that. I think looking at all of this together, probably the biggest lesson I've learned just about working in government is just adaptability, because when anything happens, whether it's a bushfire, a pandemic, anything, like, government has to be first to respond. They have to be poised, and they are making decisions that don't sort of occur in a bubble. Like, they have this crazy ripple effect. It's a huge amount of responsibility. And I think yeah, you have to be adaptable, you have to be calm, and sort of the advice that you're given in the public service is to give frank and fearless advice, because we're not political. We just work for the government of the day, and our job is just to give advice that sort of doesn't um, sugarcoat things. It's frank, and it's fearless, and it's then for government to make their decisions. So I think that was sort of a long-winded answer, but those are probably my biggest pickups so far.
Sounds like
Great
you've
experience.
it sounds like this year has been particularly formative for you, and have had some amazing experiences that have probably propelled your development significantly as a lawyer. And I think it's something I'd like to ask Leon as well, moving from focusing initially on where you actually got started to when things potentially started to fall into place for you. So can you reflect on a specific moment in your career where you felt like you had transitioned from being a young lawyer to a lawyer with a bit of clout and starting to really be at the coalface of the industry?
Yeah, look, I began life working in a very ordinary law firm. I had been promised articles, grad year, as it's now called, with a particular practitioner in probably a better firm. The practitioner died just before I was to start, and they wouldn't honour the commitment. So I got thrown into the position of having to apply late for a position. And I guess that I took the view that every single thing I did was the most important case that I had. And so that even though sometimes in truth I might have been doing low-level debt collection, which is in truth a contract dispute, I would actually dream that this was a high court case, and I'd notionally add a few zeros to the numbers, because the principles are the same. If you're arguing over $4,000 or $40,000 or 400 or 4 million or 4 billion, often the principles of law are the same. And so I would always imagine that it was no different from a much bigger kind of case. And I would always view my work like that, and did everything to the best of my ability. Because I was in I started in a pretty ordinary law firm. I was exposed to a large number of different things with no real guidance. I was thrown into the deep end, and I either would sink or swim, and I swam. And it was very challenging and very difficult. And I moved from that to a firm that eventually merged with ABL called Cooper Corbel. And at Cooper Corbel, I was exposed to a brilliant guy in Harry Cooper. Harry Cooper was the principal, the lead partner of the firm. He was incredibly savvy and commercial in his assessment of issues. He made me understand that the legal system is all about resolving, from a commercial perspective, commercial problems and issues. And I think that working with Harry exposed me to a different way of thinking and a different perspective. And so I'd say probably joining Harry gave me an opportunity to be elevated quickly, because they wanted to bring someone in over the top of me. And I was probably regarded by Harry as important to the firm, didn't want to upset me. So I got promoted at a very young age to being a senior associate. And that was a really important break, because that promotion then, of course, launched me forward soon thereafter. So I'd say it was really being exposed to someone bright, smart, savvy and sophisticated at a relatively early period of time, who reacted positively to my commitment and approach to things. And then you have kind of mentors. There'd be one other, I'd say, which is Ray Finkelstein. I was exposed to Ray Finkelstein, who was a junior barrister at the bar. Everyone regarded him as a rising star. And of course, as you know, he became a very famous barrister, then a Queen's Counsel, and then a judge. And then he's done post-judicial work too. But I hitched myself onto him at a very early age. So I'd say that identifying mentors at a young age for me was an important part of making that transition.
Amazing. Thanks so much for sharing that, Leon. I think there's a lot in that. And shout out to Harry and Ray, who played an important role in your formative years. I also heard before you mentioned that the young lawyers in your practice blow you away on a consistent basis. So I'd like to ask you another one of our more pointed questions, but really with the intent of unpacking some of those assumptions. So with mentors playing such a valuable role, and I'd love to ask this to both of you, what are some of those assumptions that potentially get in the way of setting up a young lawyer to succeed in terms of some of the experience you've had, Nechama? And similarly, what are some of the things that you expect from your young lawyers, or what are some of the things that they could change in the way that they act to actually deliver more impact every day?
Leon, you go ahead. That's
Look, to me, it's risk taking. Risk taking. I think that our younger lawyers are risk averse. And so that means instead of bouncing into the partners' offices at the end of a day when the phones aren't running hot and things have quietened down, they will think, no, better not to do that. But I always think that if you're a young person, if Nechama worked with me and she bounced in my office and at the end of the day and engaged with me, I think it was great. But most of the young practitioners won't do it. And that's risk-taking, because do you really want to take the risk of engaging with one of the senior and older partners of the firm, or is it easier to take a backward step? And so I think risk-taking is what I'd encourage them to do in a sensible way. I mean, you have to read the body language. I mean, sometimes, if you bounced into Mark Leibler's office at the wrong time, when I was a young partner, you understood it might be appropriate, but other times Mark was very engaging. So what I'd say is risk-taking, which is putting yourself out there. Our lawyers are trained to take a conservative path, and it's the conservatism which doesn't allow them to push ahead. So what I'd probably say unusually is take risk with people. If you're dealing with Ray Finkelstein, and as a young lawyer, I rang him up and said, look, you did this opinion for us. Would you mind very much if I could meet you so you could explain it to me? I didn't follow everything. And what I found is, as a young lawyer, senior lawyers are quite happy to help explain things to you, but you have to be prepared to admit you don't know. And that is putting yourself at risk. So I don't know, Nechama, do you agree?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, Leon, because I feel like I would have that same sort of hesitation that you're talking about. I think even if it's not necessarily true, there's an assumption in a law firm or any sort of context related to that there's a hierarchy and you have to respect it. But it's nice to hear that advice, and it's nice to sort of hear it from your side of the fence. And I must say, I feel like this year, as I've sort of come into my own a little bit more, and I've now worked in a lot of different contexts. I've worked in a commercial law context. I've worked in community legal centers. I've worked in research. Now I work in the public service. I've noticed that it really pays to just sometimes go out on a limb a little bit. And it's not even anything crazy. It's just like showing your humanness to someone a little bit. And, often they're also having a kind of a hard day and just want to have a chat with someone. I have an amazing assistant secretary at PMNC. She's an amazing woman. I find her so inspirational. She's very young. She occupies a very senior position, and she and I just bond over this jewelry brand that we're just obsessed with. And we talk about it all the time. And it's just such a nice way to sort of leave work behind. And it makes me feel that I can knock on her door and kind of, go and pick her brains a little bit. But in saying that, I definitely have had experiences where I felt that my bosses were a little bit bolshy or just didn't really have the time for me. And in hindsight, on reflection, I think often it was just because they were under a lot of pressure, which I didn't appreciate at the time, and they were really stressed. But I think it can be difficult when you're young, and you sometimes sort of feel just like a little bit of a nuisance. But yeah, it's good to hear Leon say that. I'm going to keep that in mind.
That's amazing insight from both of you. And before we move too far past it, Leon, I hope no one from ABL is listening to this, because after hours now, there's going to be people bouncing in, lining up outside your door to come and have a chat. And I'm going to take a string from what you sort of just shared there, Nechama, and sort of take it along and use that as a transition. So you guys obviously work in extremely high pressure environments. Nechama, you sort of reflected on this crazy year that you've had, and indeed in the broader society would reflect that too. And Leon, with all the high profile cases you've worked on and some of the experience you've already shared with us tonight, how do you guys sort of balance that really high pressure environment that you guys operate in terms of being able to disconnect and rest and ensure that you can have your best performance when you come into work every day?
Why is Leon laughing?
Because it's a really good question to ask. And Nechama, why don't you go first, and then I'll respond after you do it.
Sure. I mean, I'll go first because I to be honest, I actually don't feel that stressed generally. I think I guess it's the stereotype about the public service maybe holds true. There are plenty of people in my department who work extremely long hours and work really, really hard. But I feel like when I compare my experience this year with friends I have who've gone into law firms, it's definitely a different experience, more reasonable hours. Particularly when you're part of a grad program, you get a lot of mentorship and that kind of thing. But yeah, and as I was saying before, I think the pace of life in Canberra is so nice and really just love living here. So in general, I've had quite a good year, even as crazy sort of things are happening around me. But in saying that, I was a pretty anxious person in uni. I was a bit of a perfectionist, always did everything 100%, and sort of worked a lot on the side as well. And I don't think I realized how anxious I was at the time, but looking back, I think it was pretty unsustainable. And yeah, I had an experience last year where something sort of really stressful happened in my personal life, and right before I was about to graduate, literally the last push of my degree, I was about to hand in my honours thesis. I had a few exams left. Something sort of really difficult happened, and I actually just made a pact with myself that I was going to ask my professors for help as much as I didn't want to. I'd never asked for an extension, never handed anything in late, and I just literally made a deal with myself that I was going to ask for help, and I did it. And what I found was that when I was really candid and open with people and just showed them sort of my humanity, they reflected it back at me. And professors I'd had for 2 years told me things about themselves they would never have told me otherwise. They were so candid. And I came away having better relationships with them, and I got the help that I needed. And I think I always remember that now, and sort of, just try to remember that it's not a weakness to ask for help. And I think going forward, that would be, if I sort of encounter a situation like that again, that would be the approach I would take. And I would also sort of just commend it to anyone else as well.
Hey, Nechama, never forget the words of Professor Harry Ford, one of the textbook on company law. He wrote it. Excellence is the enemy of good.
Yeah, okay.
I like that.
Yep, got that. Yeah.
So from my perspective, I guess I've always been an adrenaline junkie. All right, I do. I love nothing better than the stress and pressure of some impossible task, some enormous complexity, some critical issue. I love it, and I fear not one bit about it. Nothing. It doesn't cause me any concern at all. I thrive on it, and in fact, Nechama, if the truth be known, I have said to some of your equivalents, but in different levels in the state and in the Commonwealth, I've been so jealous that you've been in the middle of COVID-19 and I've been on the side of it, because I feel like I've missed out some opportunity to really get into that kind of issue. But so I've found always that I thrive under that pressure. And again, this is a reflection of where I come from. When I was a young lawyer, a 28 or 29-year-old lawyer, I got into a partnership dispute, and I had 3 young children under the age of 5, and I had no money coming in. I was held to ridicule and contempt through that terrible fallout. I had the bank ringing me every Friday night, telling me they were going to sell me up and bankrupt me the next day. And so I got through all of that, and obviously it came out really well. I remember, in fact, one of my former partners, who I rang for a job through the crisis, said to me I was washed up as a lawyer, I should give up the law.
Wow.
And that to me was real pressure. And since that time, acting for clients, sorting out problems for other people is a walk in the park compared to the experience I had at 28 or 29. Now, the sad part about human nature, of course, is that we tend to excel more under distressed situations, precious situations. And so, Nechama, even the story you share about, adversity and triumph and adversity Sadly, is the way humans, I think, often go forward. We don't go forward at the same rate through an easy path. What we need is some adversity to really kick us on. That was my adversity. And the fact I even now talk about it positively, given what a terrible time it was in my life, tells you how far back it is. But I've never had a problem. In terms of turning off, you guys asked the right question, which is when you're doing what Nechama is doing and you're dealing with issues that are so important to the country, how do you actually go home on a weekend, kick back and relax? And so in my case, I ski, but, of course, I want to ski hard, fast, focused, but that focus comes into it. Or I might go out in a boat. It's got to be driven. It's got to be, in fact, I always say to Ariel, my partner, if I were to retire and relax, I'd have to be the best relaxer I know. Otherwise, I couldn't relax. But it's a problem, actually, that turning off, because I still, when I'm really, really busy, I can wake up in the middle of the night at 4 a.m. and make notes of what I think I ought to do. Very hard. By contrast, I remember, when the late Richard Pratt was dying and we were trying to have him acquitted in the hours before his death, I had a huge argument with my kids. And I remember I was talking to one of my partners about it, and he said, Leon, you're now going into court on a critical application for Australia's wealthiest citizen at the time to try and have him acquitted before he dies, because it's the most important wish of your client. And you have an argument with your daughter, and that bothers you, but going in front of all the cameras, that doesn't bother you at all. And all that pressure and appearing in the court, I said, it's exactly right. Exactly right. One of them is professional, one's personal. The personal issues will always dominate for me more than the professional pressures.
Yeah. Wow. That's an amazing anecdote to hear. I mean, yeah, it's funny. I feel like for some reason, when we go to work, we tend to forget that people have personal lives and have all this context going on in the background, even though we ourselves have it. And yeah, it's really, really important to remember.
So Nechama, one of the things I often will say to people is, listen, when I hear about it after the fact, I'll often say, why don't you share with us, not all the detail, if you've got some difficulty, tell us, because then we can modify our expectations until you're on top of it. And again, in workplaces, people tend to be really private, and in truth, they're good things. If someone's going through some acrimonious separation of a relationship, it's helpful if people in the office know, because then they'll understand why work performance might be different. We tend not to share those things, although I think in COVID-19, we've probably shared more through Zoom calls
right.
than meetings than normal.
We've all become oversharers. That's right.
Wow, I found what you said there, Leon, incredibly inspiring, because I see myself as a bit of a maximizer and always having, grand ambitions and wanting more and more and never being really satisfied. But so it's quite encouraging to see that drive is something that doesn't actually go away, despite really, making it to the top and achieving some great accolades. And on that, on that note of actually making it to the top, I guess part of what seems to be so instrumental to your success is just this innate desire to be a lawyer, to be amongst the industry. It just seems like it comes naturally to you. I'm interested to know if there's any sort of skills that, and what comes to mind is the story of Roger Federer, where he was known for really working on his weaknesses, sharpening up on the tools of trade that didn't really come naturally to him. I'm wondering if there were specific skills that you had to acquire or recognize that you had to acquire to really make you what you are or what you've become in the industry.
From my end, I guess, and I know you might find this odd, I think about everything. I think about the letter that someone might write me from my opponent. I analyze everything. I think of the way people present. I think about you guys, look at this podcast, look what you're going to get out of it for wherever you're headed. And I think, how smart are you for doing something like that? Because you can't help but to learn by osmosis. It's a clever thing to do. So I think about everything, and whenever I finish a matter or a case or a proceeding, I always reflect upon what I have brought to it. I always think about what is it that I brought to this matter. I think about every meeting I have, what I'm going to say. I plan voraciously for what I do. In fact, even for this podcast, I found it difficult because I wanted to be a natural, but my natural tendency was to think about what it is I'd say. So I think about all those things, and I also study people around me. So, Ray Finkelstein's got a disarming sense of humour, and he uses it to break tension. And I saw it in court. I remember once in the old days, before mobile phones really kicked off, there was a barrister before Ken Hayne who became a High Court judge, and Ken was very rigid in the way he ran his case when he was a single judge. And the phone went off, and he had a rule about phones going off in court, and it'd be executed for something like that by Ken Hayne in those days. And the phone goes off by a barrister that Ken didn't like. And we knew that the judge was going to launch at him, and Fink jumped up and said, "Your Honour, it could be my mother." And the whole courtroom burst out laughing, including the judge. And I realised it was the most brilliant advocacy. He broke the tension with humour. And so again, they're all things. You look at the people around you and you learn from them. I'm sure, Nechama, there must be some incredible people around you where you think about the way they present, the way they write, the way they deal with problems, their structure. So it's thinking about things all the time, I guess.
Wow. Yeah, I think that really resonates a lot. I think I'm somewhat similar. I'm definitely a planner. I think lawyers often are. They are obsessed with detail, because a case or some transactional matter or really anything you're doing, it could literally hinge on a small detail. And I think as well, I think working in government, you always have to be sort of thinking 2 steps ahead, because you need to be thinking about how people will receive a certain decision. You need to understand who you're working for. Your boss is essentially, my ultimate boss is the Prime Minister, and you need to understand what his priorities are. Really cool. And and you need to, anything you put forward, you need to be considering how he would receive it, how his other ministers will receive it, how the public will receive it. You need to sort of be considering from all angles. And actually, the people I've had the opportunity to learn from this year, that's probably the biggest thing I've been learning, because I have never really had any exposure to any of this. And I've noticed that people who are experienced public servants are amazing at just sort of taking the pulse of government and the public, and just sort of anticipating how things will go down, basically.
And Nechama, this is another one of my big bugbears with our lawyers. You must be across all of the news and newspapers.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you know what? Last year, I'm embarrassed to say, but I didn't really take much interest in politics. Didn't really read the news, like maybe saw it on my Facebook feed. Now I read like all kinds of news every day, first thing in the morning. One of our jobs when Parliament is sitting is to update the Prime Minister's briefs. Every morning they have to be in before 10 o'clock. So we, just absolutely scour the media. So I have the Guardian live blog open all day. You really have, particularly in your area, you can't miss anything. You have to know everything. But I find that really exciting, and I love that. I think it's great. And you sort of end up being interested in things that you just would never have thought, like the Commonwealth Integrity Commission, would never really have thought that would speak to me, but it just becomes your thing. And yeah.
Well, I think the same holds true for lawyers. Lawyers often, I think, don't read newspapers, they don't read literature. They need to read, because reading creates opportunity. You have to be able to talk to people. And if you're going to talk to senior partners about what's happening, knowing what's going on in the media is really important. And so it's an important discipline to start from a young age. And I don't think many people do it. The other thing which I'd say, looking back on my career, that I think was really formative for me was friendship. I know you might laugh and say, why friendship in a work context? And the answer is because it's if you can work with friends every day of your life, then you enjoy every day. And you manage risk much better, because, in a frank and honest way, you can talk to a colleague and say, what do you think? Or how do you analyse this? And I've been blessed, because probably my best friend and I have been in partnership together for 30 years. He often tells the story that before we joined to work together at ABL, we were in the same building but in separate law firms. And he and I were both paged in law firms in which we didn't work, because we often spent so much time with one another. I often tell the aspiring rising stars in the office, make friends, lifelong friendships, if you can, so that you've got that support base going through and that company going through, and it adds to the enjoyment in your work life too.
Wow.
Absolutely. Such great advice there. And not just in the professional way, but in the personal way. And I guess to that point that you made before around how you switch off or how do you balance your energy, it seems like you've built some amazing support networks around you to bounce ideas off and really support you when you need. I'd love to sort of pick up on what you just mentioned and Nechama, you mentioned around reading literature. So Leon, first to you, what pieces of literature would you actually recommend somebody read if they had one book, in front of them that they could read and gain a lot from? And similarly, Nechama, what do you find really useful as a resource to sort of clue up on the things of today? I'll start with you, Leon.
Look, I was very influenced by Dickens, Great Expectations or David Copperfield, because of my past, which of course was I start with very humble beginnings, without much money, without much success, and through a series of relationships and issues and adversity, there's always triumph at the end. And so, as I said, I always found the idea of reading people, different characters in life, and understanding the types of characters you're going to come across as you work your way through life. I found that kind of reading quite inspiring and interesting. And I guess starting from where I was, which was so under such pressure financially, I'll often say to people, you've got a Macorba problem, when there's some corporate restructuring problem, that is, £21 expense, £19 income, you've got a problem. And it's often Dickens that I would look to as a young, when I was reading, because our problem is reading personalities, working out how to advocate before courts, opponents, clients. So that I always found those sorts of things great. But I read, Dostoevsky. I read Victor Hugo. In fact, it took me a long time when I was reading the brothers Karamazov to understand that Alyosha Alexandrovich, Alex, and a few other names were actually the same character, because I didn't study it. So when I read it, no one was there to tell me it was the same guy.
I think that's a common thing with Russian novels.
Yeah, my father upset me because he told me after I read it in English, the Russian version was much better.
Wow, how amazing to be able to read that in the original, though. That's incredible. Well, Leon, I was just going to say on Dickens, you just have to hope you don't end up in a Bleak House kind of scenario.
How about you, Nechama? What sort of, if you had advice for a young professional entering law, what publication or what sort of piece of media or even a book, a piece of literature would you recommend for them to sort of clue up and succeed within the industry?
This is quite a hard question. There's really not something that really sort of jumps out at me. I think everyone has that one thing that really sort of speaks to them. It's a book they saw, it's a movie they watched. I mean, there are some movies you can watch, like Leon was sort of saying about watching Perry Mason. There are some movies you can watch that literally make you want to jump off the couch and just become a lawyer. They're so just so inspiring. I watched a few months ago Dark Waters, which is an amazing movie about this one attorney who sort of takes on this chemical giant DuPont that was poisoning this town with chemicals and sort of being dishonest about it. I think my advice would probably be just to read widely and broadly, and to just sort of try and understand that you don't live in the world you live in is bigger than your little bubble. So Leon was sort of speaking before about the importance of just really meeting a whole range of people and getting to understand them. And I think something that I've noticed quite obviously in Canberra is I grew up in Sydney. I lived there my whole life, and having moved here, I now work with people from WA, Adelaide, South Australia, like all of Melbourne, all over the place, and people who come from very different backgrounds to my own. And particularly if you're working in government, that is so important. You have to understand the people that you're serving. You can't assume that everyone's lives are like yours. yeah, when I was at Services Australia and we were speaking to people from all over the country, like often in some of the worst moments of their lives, to be able to have that sort of empathy and start to realize that people are very different to you is really important. So I think my advice would be just to try. I think like I know our generation gets a lot of slack for sort of being kind of entrenched in our views and kind of shutting down debate and that kind of thing. That's definitely a common sort of thing that's thrown at our generation. But I think there's a lot of value in reading widely. So read newspapers you don't necessarily agree with. I read The Australian all the time. I don't always agree with it, but it's, good to just kind of test your own views. Yeah, that would be my advice.
Like, hang on a minute. We got to ask this. I at every interview, I ask people, applying for a job, what book they're reading, so I can make some judgment out of it. Now, guys, this is one for you. What book are you each reading? And then you and I should assess what it tells us.
Absolutely.
That's a great question. I'm currently reading Ride of a Lifetime, which is Bob Iger's book. Bob was Rob, but call him Bob, his nickname, was the CEO of Walt Disney and did quite amazingly there through his various M&A transactions. So very, very interesting, very digestible. I highly recommend the read.
What you guys don't see on the other side of the screen is the spotlights beaming down, making this sort of throw of power over to you guys even more intense. But I'm actually rereading Fooled by Randomness by Nassim Taleb, which I absolutely love. And it's all around, as humans, the sort of extra weight we put on our decisions when we get something right, and we don't really attribute any of that to luck. But when we get it wrong, we often will, blame luck as a key variable. And he sort of looks at that in the context of the markets. So it's a really interesting book.
I think we've got his Black Swan classic right up there.
Yeah, we've got Black Swan up there too.
Interesting. Well, my one observation would be that you're both reading nonfiction.
Yeah,
my favorite.
It's a problem.
My favorite's actually
it's a
fiction.
Problem.
It is a problem. I agree. Got to get back on the fiction. So guys, I want to move us along because I know we're sort of approaching time here. And I've got one for you, Leon, and I feel like you've touched on some of the elements already in terms of advice you give to people. But one of the incredible accolades that you've got, hopefully hanging on your wall somewhere behind you, is 2019 Lawyer of the Year, which is absolutely fantastic. I would love to know, if you were giving advice to someone, what might 3 tangible things be that they could start implementing in their day from tomorrow to start having similar or improved results in their work?
I guess the first is what I would call passion. Lawyers are trained to be dispassionate, objective, and clinical in the way they deal with things. And I think we have to be objective and clinical in the way we deal with things, but there's nothing wrong with passion. And disclosing passion and interest is really important. And so I'd say that's an important aspect of getting ahead as a lawyer. And clients are drawn to passion. That is, if they can see you are absolutely interested in the problem you're dealing with or the issues in front of you, it goes a long way to developing positive relationships with clients and also drives you as well. So I'd say show passion and interest in everything you do if you're a young lawyer. Secondly, I think that lawyers need to apply what I call the 80-20 rule. Lawyers tend to focus on the 20% issue, not the 80% likelihood. So whenever you've got a problem and you know that the likely outcome, the likely major issues are in the 80% category, lawyers tend to focus on the 20% that aren't likely. And I think the smarter, more sophisticated clients, they want 80-20 lawyers. They want lawyers who devote 80% of their time to 80% of the problem, not the 20% of the outliers. And so, Nechama, picking up a point you talked about detail. I think that sometimes lawyers get lost in the weeds. That is, they chase every rabbit down every burrow. They boil the ocean, I think is one of the expressions some guru used years ago. And I've always thought 80-20 is a really important aspect of it. And thirdly, what I probably would say is I think lawyers generally lack empathy. That is, they don't understand that the problems that they're dealing with are not kind of like someone else's problems. They're the kind of problems you yourself could get into. And so again, I come back to my own experience, having been a plaintiff in a very large Supreme Court action. It gave me a very different perspective of the law. Up until then, I used to think, how do all these people get into all these problems? Or how do these people muck up their transactions so badly? But having been in the middle of one, I've realised it's pretty easy to do, and it's complicated. And that the law is, in commercial law anyway, it's really, and litigation in particular, it's about problem solving. It's not about being true to the pursuit of black letter law. It's about there's a problem that's got to be solved, and here are some rules and equations. It's mathematical, but focusing on outcomes is really important. So I'd probably say that being focused on outcomes. So you've got an understanding of the black letter law, but what's the outcome we want to achieve, and how do we get there? And so that'd be kind of 3 tips for me to pass on to some of the younger lawyers starting out, particularly in private practice.
Nechama, I'm going to ask you a similar question. So I'm going to ask you for some advice for younger lawyers, but from a slightly different perspective. So I guess, there's a lot of, industries are changing quite rapidly, and there's a lot of, tech and automation that are changing the way we do things. And I guess from what you've seen in the law industry from your time so far, what advice would you give to young aspiring lawyers who are potentially still at university, trying to get into the game, so that they can really ensure that their skills are, I guess, timelessly in demand, or that they're best placed to take advantage of the opportunities that are coming about because of the proliferation of things like technology and automation?
I obviously don't have a huge amount of perspective on this, but I think my advice, this is just the advice I try to sort of give myself, is to first of all, just not be afraid of it and actually embrace it. I actually think that a lot of the automation that's sort of being taken up in the legal industry actually makes our jobs easier. It does the kind of boring paper shifting stuff that you don't want to do when you're doing discovery and you're dealing with thousands of documents, when you're drawing up a contract and you can just input a few things and it draws up a sort of template for you. That's the kind of work you don't want to be doing. You want to be using your skills to be thinking really creatively and like dealing with really novel situations. That's something I saw so much this year, was lawyers like the Solicitor General having to give advice on constitutional principles that had literally never been tested before, and having to just think so outside of the box and deal with really novel facts. So I think that's the first thing, is to embrace it. But I also think this is very similar to what Leon said, and I think a lot of lawyers will tell you this. Law, at the end of the day, is a very human exercise. And when a person comes to a lawyer, it's often because they've really found themselves in the shit, and they are probably in some of the worst and most stressful moments of their life. And they want to sit opposite a human being, whether it's a large commercial dispute they found themselves in the middle of, whether it's a personal problem. They are probably scared and worried, and they want the reassurance of another person sort of listening to the story. And it's then the lawyer's work to go and translate that narrative into a legal, solution that they can then pursue. I just can't imagine a world, even if AI, is turning out judgments and, like it's getting really intelligent. It will be able to do the things that we do, but I just think there will always be a place for a lawyer, just because at the end of the day, it's just an exchange between human beings. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that you framed it as sort of automation and technology taking away some of those boring elements to sort of elevate you and give you the time to do those sort of more human things that add value, like being empathetic and being there for people. I'm going to shift us into, I suppose, the last section of our conversation as we approach time. And this one's a fun one. So we'll start with you there, Nechama. If you had to sort of take a little time machine back to 4 years ago when you were 21 years old, what advice would you give yourself to sort of navigate yourself up to this point now?
I think I would tell myself to just calm down a little bit and just not be so much of a stress pot. It's so, looking back, it's always so unnecessary, but it's so hard to do in the moment. I think that would be my biggest advice. But honestly, when I look at where I am now, and I'm so happy sort of with where I've landed, I don't know where I'll go, but I'm happy with where I am now. My advice would be to myself to just keep doing what I'm doing, and just like I had a conviction really early on, that I was interested in public policy and didn't really want to spend time in commercial law, and I was pretty certain about that. And so I would just tell myself to stick to my guns and just pursue what I had this gut feeling about.
You're so reasonable, Nechama. You're always so reasonable.
Now I'm keen to hear yours, Leon.
Going back to when I'm 21 or when I'm 60?
Yeah, just a few years ago, if you were to hop in that time machine and talk to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give him?
I would probably tell myself to just draw breath, slow down sometimes. Along the way in my path, I've made very quick decisions on things to my detriment. I remember, I'm at ABL. I'm obviously loving it at ABL. I've had a fantastic career here. But when I was first approached as a very young lawyer to go to ABL, I told them I didn't want to go to a firm that was established. I wanted to build my own from the bottom up. And that was just such arrogance. Or when someone, and it was stupid. I should have really reflected on it, but I didn't. Or I think I mentioned to you that I was promoted by Harry Cooper at Cooper Corbel at a time because they were bringing someone in over the top of me. And I had said to them, if you bring someone in over the top of me, you can promote me all you like, I'm leaving. Well, maybe I shouldn't have packed up and left immediately thereafter. Maybe it would have been smarter because I could have avoided the entire partnership dispute had I just drawn breath and checked it out. But I was one of these people, if I drew a line in the sand, I never varied from it. And I think looking back at myself, I'd say sometimes I should have been more reflective before I moved. But the truth is, it's hard when you look back because you don't know whether all those things at the end of the day, in my position, were not formative. That is that you have to make mistakes. I remember reading something about an old man describing his life, and he said, looking back on it with that kind of question, I spent all my life walking the tightrope of life, and I carried a very big stick with me to balance, to make sure I never fell. And he said, looking back, what I think I should have done was fallen off a couple of times and then climbed back up. But the fall wasn't such a bad thing. And so that's why when I think about those things, I think, you know what, maybe I did have to fall along the way. Maybe it gave me a different perspective. So I don't know, looking back on it, I think it would have been better given all the hardship not to have gone through it. But as I said, we learn through hardship. But the truth is, I think, as I look back at my professional life, it's been phenomenal. There's never been a day that I'm not interested. I mean, I love the fact that I'm here with Nechama, who's starting out with the world ahead of her, with such enthusiasm and such dreaminess about it, in such a position of great responsibility at such a young age, or you guys. I mean, it's quite inspiring to see, and obviously I wish all of you the very best of luck. And I hope one day that I'll ask you that question, you'll give me the answer about what you tell yourself when you're back at these times.
Thanks, Leon. No, I think for me, it's just been so nice to speak to someone who's been in the industry for such a long time and just does not seem even the least bit jaded. It's it's really quite inspiring.
No, Nechama, it's immaturity. Can you believe someone of my age can be so immature?
It's funny. That's right. How are you not cynical yet? What happened?
So there's another sort of question that we are planning to ask all of our guests, and I'm super curious about this one, and especially after you guys give praise to each other. If you guys have gone through this conversation and you've had a question in your mind, or you're just curious to ask each other something, now's your opportunity to sort of break down that barrier and ask, because I know often you won't get that opportunity when you're at work. So maybe starting with you, Nechama, do you have any questions you'd like to ask Leon?
I mean, to be honest, you stole the question I wanted to ask, which is I'm always interested to know if a person could go back to sort of a specific moment in their life, and sort of if there was something they'd want to tell themselves. But I suppose maybe, Leon, we've talked a lot about moments like that in your professional life, but maybe you can tell us about something in your personal life, because you've spoken about how important that is. That can be in the backdrop of this very busy professional life. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that. So maybe you can tell us something significant that happened in your personal life that's maybe shaped you, or even just shaped the lawyer that you have ultimately become.
Look, Nechama, it's a hard question for me to deal with, but I'll deal with it straight. the biggest failing in my life concerned my failed marriage. My ex-wife and I obviously separated, but the point that kind of told me a lot about where I was at, and I think I lost my way with work a bit, was I remember the very first big corporate collapse in Australia's history concerned a company called Brash's in 1994. It was the introduction of voluntary administration, and it was an incredibly complicated matter because no one knew anything about the law, and everything we did was new and novel. It was in the public domain, in the media, and it was a seminal case for me. How old was I? I was 37 or something. So I was young, but it's the biggest corporate collapse under voluntary administration ever. And we worked day and night, literally day and night. And the case settled in July of 1994 after an all-nighter. In fact, I can tell you now because it's so old, but we had to get the document signed by midnight, and the board was made up of some pretty old people. And I had to they were asleep. I literally put the pen in their hand and wrote their name on the document.
Oh my goodness.
Leon, that sounds.
No, I wrote them up, but I'm just saying it was that kind of moment. But on the day, and then I got home having done the all-nighter, and my ex-wife and I had a terrible fight, and I was so upset because it was a great moment of pride, and I'd worked around the clock, and our team had been great, and we had a terrible fight, and I could never understand why. But about 3 months later, I was asked to give a talk in Queensland about this transaction. It was novel. And it was a big talk. There would have been 500 or 600 people. And I told the story, which culminated with that night of signing the document. And I turned around and I said, yep. And we signed that document on the 5th of July, 1994. And at that moment, it hit me. I said, my wedding anniversary. And every person in that room knew that it was only at that point in time that it dawned upon me that it was my wedding anniversary. And then I realized what I'd missed. And I was incredibly saddened by it. And it probably reflected where I was at. And I don't think I had work-life balance quite right. And to me, it's a huge failing. But it's helped me in dealing with others coming through because now I'm far more cognizant of the importance of work-life balance.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, that's quite an amazing, obviously quite a distressing time in your life, but I think, again, as I was saying before, if you can just sort of be candid about these things, people will reflect it back at you. So thank you.
How about you, Leon? Do you have any questions for Nechama?
Yeah, I do. And Nechama, I will frame it so you have time to think about it because you'll know where I'm going. One of the things, I was an alpha male kind of partner, not very sensitive of the challenges for female partners in the practice of law. But I worked with a brilliant woman, a young woman, Leonie Thompson, who recently died. In fact, she was married to Ray Finkelstein. And Leonie educated me as an alpha male partner about the challenges for women, unconscious bias and many other things. And I became a convert. And as you know, converts are zealots. And so for me, one of the big challenges for females in professional life are some of those issues. We've recently had a four-cornered show, which you're probably all over, Nechama, I hope you are, which talks about problems for particularly young women in Canberra and some of the pressures and that arise for women and some of the imbalances of power when particularly young women are working with very powerful men. And I just wondered whether you had any views about that, whether you have any apprehensions about it, whether you have any strategies on how you would deal with it in light of some of the revelations about Christian Porter, certainly, and about Alan Tudge, and about life in Canberra and in the bubble generally.
Yeah, that is a big question. I'm trying to think how to answer it because I have so many thoughts on it. This is something that occupies my thinking a lot. I think my thoughts on it are probably, I think the culture needs to change from the top. People, when I have this discussion with people, sometimes the response is, why don't women say something? Why don't they complain at the time? Why didn't they go to someone? And I just think that is totally missing the point of the issue. And I think the fact that someone right at the top knew what was going on and sort of showed willful blindness, I think is really irresponsible. And I think a really good example of how things change when you have a culture change right from the highest levels is once Susan Kiefel was on the High Court, she's our justice. Once she got wind of the allegations against Dyson Hayden, she ordered an independent investigation. And at the time those women had first come forward, 2 judges on the bench, including the Chief Justice, knew about the complaints and nothing ever happened. And once a woman was on the bench, she ordered an independent investigation, and all those things have come to light. And whether that results in prosecutions, whatever, but the fact is that it came out, and there's been a huge reckoning in the legal profession as a result of it. So I think my first thoughts are that the expectation can't be on junior people and women all the time to sort of bear the burden of speaking out about it. And it can be really scary when you're in a position where you're surrounded by people with a lot of power who have the ability to influence the direction your career takes. It's just easier not to say anything. So I think that people at the top who maybe are actually just sort of insulated from these kind of things by virtue of where they're sitting need to be, whether it's that they need to be trained better, whether they need to take the responsibility to educate themselves about it. I think that's where the responsibility lies. I must say, in my personal experience, certainly anecdotally, I've had a lot of female friends have really, really awful experiences in the legal profession. I have been quite lucky in that I haven't. I think probably the worst I've had is really alpha male sort of personality type stuff, which I think is also something that would be worth having further conversations about. I do think it's just sort of important to recognize that women operate and work in so many different ways. One woman might be really loud and kind of brash in her way of doing things. Another woman might be more reserved and kind of less forthcoming. I think none of those should ever be mistaken for a lack of intelligence or a lack of judgment. And I think those are some of the stereotypes that we maybe have to reckon with in the workplace. I could go on. I think about this all the time. But yeah.
Hey, Nechama, did you see the question coming?
Do you know what? I thought we would inevitably have to discuss this. So I'm really glad that you asked. I'm glad. But it's funny, Leon, that you say that, because I wanted to talk about it, but I didn't want to bring it up because I thought if I bring it up, well, obviously she's going to bring it up. She's a woman, but I mean, that's just interesting in itself. I should feel, totally okay to speak about it, but I'm glad you brought it up regardless.
Well, I think men have an obligation to bring these issues up.
I agree. Thank you.
Wow, that was incredible. And I think it's a beautiful, beautiful note for us to end on, recognizing that it is time. Guys, thanks so much for joining us this evening. That was an absolutely incredible show. So inspiring. I think for me, there's 3 key takeaways. The first one is that, do what you love and pursue excellence, and good things will follow. The second is that the pursuit of winning and the feeling of success is something that never gets old. And lastly, it sounds like being a lawyer is a hell of a lot of fun.
Definitely. Especially being able to talk to you guys and you guys riffing about your inside law nerd jokes that I somewhat understood, somewhat didn't. But it's so amazing to see the passion.
Well, the one thing which we left off, which I should have said to you, I think storytelling is really important too. And I hope you notice I tell a lot of stories. But what I discovered was that came from my history, my past. My family was storytellers. But what I've discovered across the globe is the most successful lawyers are storytellers. They tell great stories, and stories are quite engaging and educative. I try always to make them self-deprecating, but in truth, they're not always that way. But I'm just saying, storytelling is a really great thing too. And all of what you're doing will help you guys with your storytelling. And I'm sure, Nechama, what you're seeing will be in your mind forever. And I'm looking forward to hearing some more of your stories too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leon. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. It was really, really great to be involved in this. So thank you guys as well.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Have a lovely evening. And for everyone listening, thanks for enjoying the show.
Cheers.